I'm Kay Hogan, Director of Library Services. Welcome to the Marshall Hamilton Library at North Florida Community College. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to come help us honor Joe Akerman. The library is privileged to dedicate the Florida collection to him. He spent many happy hours here in the library, and he will forever be in our hearts and minds. Before we get started, I would like to recognize several guests who are with us. The Akerman family, Joe's wife Princess, his son Mark, Mark's wife Angie, their children Cole and Emma, Joe's daughter Amy and her husband Brad. Joe's sister is with us, Shane Conley, and Joe's brother Mike Conley, his other brother Bert Conley, and his wife Judy. We're also delighted to have the members of the Treasurers of Madison County with us today, and we have several members of our boards of trustees here, and Jim Hanley from the Florida Cattlemen's Association is here as well. Thank you all for coming. Our guest speakers knew Joe very well. I believe each will share something special about him and how he touched their lives. Our first speaker is Mr. Mark Akerman. He's the son of Joe and Princess Akerman. Mark also has a love of Florida history, and he co-authored Jacob Summerlin, King of the Crackers, with his dad in 2005. Welcome, Mark.
Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you so much for being here to honor my dad, Joe A. Akerman Jr. I'd like to first recognize his beloved college librarians, and they really were beloved to him. I have never met anyone in my academic career that had more of an appreciation for librarians, media specialists, and archivists than my dad did. If Dad were here today, he would want to thank the current library staff and Mrs. Hogan, Mrs. White, and Mrs. Sale. Of course, Dad always had a special place in his heart for Mrs. Liu Sands. She was not only the college's first librarian, but served as a research mentor for Dad in the early years. Mrs. Sands, your presence here today means a great deal to our family. Dad was a native Floridian, as most of you know, and grew up in Orlando at a time when young boys could experience so much of the outdoors. He hunted and fished, where Disney World is now, and refused to take my sister to the famous theme park for many years because of what it meant to his hunting lands. But those thoughts and feelings seemed to change as the grandchildren came along. He researched, taught, and wrote about all aspects of Florida history, and a lot of it done right here from these shelves and interlibrary loan. He enjoyed a special relationship with his Florida history peers, who were also writing and researching various aspects of Florida history. State archivist at the time, Calvin Jones, became a close family friend through his relationship with the discovery in the 1970s of the early Franciscan missions throughout North Florida. Dad often took me and a few of my friends to mission dig sites in and around Madison County. Stevie McMahon, Harvey Green, and others, and I became enamored with these discoveries that set the tone for a new respect for Florida's rich history. Florida history began to flourish through these discoveries, and Dad returned to the classroom of NFCC, or Florida Junior College, to share real cutting-edge discoveries right here in our own backyard, something that was traditionally reserved for the elite universities. Years later, after establishing a reputation as a historian and writer and building on his love of his native history, he began exploring those early days as a young fellow in Orlando and the sight of cattle and cowboys in Florida that were so often depicted as unique to the Western American frontier. Soon his discoveries led to much research and his association with the Florida Cattlemen's Association and the cracker cattle culture and its people. His manuscript, Florida Cattleman, was published by the Florida Cattlemen's Association in 1976, and this association was a highlight of his professional career. He wrote more books and contributed to numerous anthologies and gave talks on his books and Florida history in general all over Florida for the next 30 years. While his other works were noteworthy, Florida Cattleman was by far his groundbreaking achievement. Dad brought the history and respect for the Florida cattle industry to the nationwide stage. Florida Cattleman is in every major library in the country, and even today, Mom and I will occasionally field an international call from people wanting information about Florida's rich cattle history. Florida Cattleman set in motion a plethora of cracker novels, short stories, cowboy lyrics, and poetry. Florida novelist Patrick Smith told Dad once that he used the Florida Cattleman as the template for his book, Land Remembered. Through it all, Dad never forgot the administration, faculty, staff at North Florida Junior College, always giving much credit for his success to his colleagues and providing a marketing preface for the college at every talk he ever gave. So if you're here today as a colleague, student, historian, cattleman, or friend, on behalf of my family, we would like to thank you for coming. I can tell you he would be very pleased with this recognition. God bless you all.
Our next speaker is Dr. David Proctor. He is a former NFCC history instructor and department chair for the History and Social Sciences. The library still misses him as well. It was a competition as to who was down here the most sometimes, Dr. Proctor or Mr. Akerman. Welcome, Dr. Proctor.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It is so much fun to be back at North Florida Community College and back at Madison. And I first want to thank all the librarians, Kathy Sale and Kay, and all of you for inviting me over. Joe Akerman meant a lot to me, and I'm going to sort of explain my relationship with Joe and things that we did and how much I learned from Joe, and try to work in some fun Joe Akerman stories and wish through me. And I shouldn't have trouble with that. So again, thanks to everybody. I want to thank everybody for having me over. I tell you, I drove in and I parked in my old parking spot, and I almost had a sort of a misty-eyed moment because I realized I could just walk into the general classroom building and Joe would be there with his cup of coffee, and it really moved me when I thought of that, because I had 10 years of that. So that's how much Joe meant to me. But I want to talk about things that I learned from Joe, and there was a lot. For starters, Joe was, of course, a big Gator fan. And I'm a diehard Seminole. My family goes back at Florida State to even before it was Florida State College for women. My grandmother was there when it was Florida State College. And so I grew up around just complete Seminoles, and my parents were in the 1949 class that got to vote on them being Seminoles, so you get the point. And Mark's orange and blue tie just reminds me of that. And of course it's even funnier because I married a Gator, and Helen wished she could have been here, but she had to help her mom today. Something came up, so she had to miss. But Joe and I had a great relationship with the Florida Gator thing in the Seminole. Joe taught me how to handle that rivalry with grace and humor, and taught me that there are a lot of Gators out there and you better learn to deal with them. But very good one. So Joe was terrific in that. And I don't know of anyone who was a better sport about the whole thing than Joe Akerman. I mean, honestly, he would wear FSU cap, he'd make bets with people, he was just really a true class act. And when you look at some of the foolishness and mean-spiritedness that goes along with it, and it's all so silly, you realize what Joe taught people just in that alone. I hadn't meant to talk about that, but that orange and blue tie there just kind of brought it all back. Okay, brought so many things back about Joe. Now, Joe and I worked together, just to familiarize you with it, Joe and I worked together for 10 years. I was hired in 1994. I think Mr. Catron, I took Jim's place, and he was on the committee, and I see so many other familiar faces out there. And Joe was assigned to be my mentor, to teach me the ropes and everything. And what a perfect mentor he was. But with Joe, you never, Joe was teaching you things, but you really didn't know you're being taught. That's the thing about Joe. He didn't lecture you, he didn't do any of that. He used gentle humor and funny stories and history to lead you along. And I needed a lot of leading along. I finished my PhD at Florida State. I taught some classes as a grad student at FSU, but they were big and it was very formal, and I didn't know what I was doing anyway. So they didn't, anyway, we somehow got through it. And then I taught a little bit at TCC, but it was the same thing. I was bogged down in grad school, and when you're in grad school in history at a place like FSU, you're in these seminars, and the professors are very formal. It's a big place. It's very anonymous. It's the opposite of the really good things that you have here at North Florida. So I'm coming out of that environment. This is my first full-time job at North Florida Community College. And I really, I'm from Tallahassee and I grew up there, but I'm not from Madison, and so there's a lot to learn about that. And of course, but I had my trusty Joe Akerman there to lead me through the ropes on that. Being from Tallahassee is still not the same as being from Madison. And so Joe was my mentor, and I was doing so many things wrong. Teaching the way it was at Florida State, which really is not going to work with the sort of students and audience that we had here, and really TCC either. And Joe gradually taught me to lighten up, to relax, and be a good history teacher. And your job is not to create history majors, although that's terrific when somebody wants to major in it. But what we really needed to do is expose the general public to students. Most of them are not majoring in history. It may be nursing, it may be all different things, business and all those things. But we need to get people interested in history. That was Joe's thing, is to tell stories and make it fun and get people to like history. And what I would do is walk in there and, okay, we're going to have blue books today, and we're going to do this, and bam, 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 bam. And they're all terrified and probably liking history even less. So, if I had to point to one thing about Joe Akerman, he taught me how to be a good history, I try to be a good history teacher. He taught me how to be a better history teacher and to make people interested in history and get people to like history. And then that's what he did. Now, I was sort of, they made me department chair, so I was technically Joe's supervisor. Now, I knew early on, you're not going to supervise Joe Akerman. Joe Akerman's going to be Joe Akerman, and he's going to go do what he does, which is really good. And I quickly learned to just let that go on. Joe's a terrific athlete, and just let him be Joe Akerman and learn from Joe Akerman about being a good history teacher. But he taught me how to approach students who really didn't have a strong academic background, or students who did not have much history background, or honestly zero history knowledge, which some of them do. And Joe showed me how to reach out to those people, how to make them feel, welcome, and by the end of the day, you're bringing people to history. You're getting people to like a history class and not something they run off and tell how horrible it was. I never quit throwing the blue books at them, though. They never liked those blue books, but anyway. So Joe would show me that. And he always did it with a story. He didn't do it with, now, David, here's what you need to do. There was never, I can't remember Joe ever doing that. But what he would do is get that cup of coffee, and our offices were right beside each other. We were the entire history department. There was only two of us. So we were the NFCC history department for 10 years. And there was one or two part-timers, and but it was Joe and I. Joe would come around with that cup of coffee, and he'd have a funny story. Some student had really, really said something wild and crazy, in an essay, and they do that. Joe and I used to compile funny stories. By the end of the day, you've got the Germans bombing Pearl Harbor, and you've got I don't know what all coming out of there. And he would show me the humor in it and show me how to lead them and not get frustrated. So I just learned so much from Joe in that way as a teacher. And it made me think on the way over how valuable Joe was, and that in many ways Joe Akerman is what is desperately needed today in the history profession. That I had this big light come on over my head on the way over here. That's what's, and I thought about that as what is so lacking today in the history field, particularly as it's taught in the major universities and the big research universities. And I love history, and I think if we want to have a good America and an America of thoughtful citizens and keep our republic going into the future, we're going to need people to know history. And I can just tell you, after 10 years here, and it'll be in 2014, it'll be 10 years teaching at TCC, students are plenty smart. That is not the problem at all. They're plenty smart. But our culture and the entertainment industry and the electronics, there's just a long list of things that have just erased, historical knowledge for our young people, and now many adults too. And it's people are plenty smart. They got as much brain power as they've ever had. But history is suffering from all those things. And unfortunately, the great universities are getting ever more specialized and ever more research focused and ever less relevant to the vast majority of Americans. And without launching off on a huge sermon about that, of which I have many opinions, I was thinking about how Joe tied into that and how much good he did over all those years, not trying to make somebody into a researcher, not trying to beat on them and not trying to be too rigid, but lead them gently toward an appreciation of history. And I frankly don't know anybody that I've ever encountered in my whole profession that did that better than Joe Akerman. He was the master at it, and people would leave his classes having enjoyed history, and maybe they would take their kids to a museum or a battlefield or something like that, and that's what we really needed. So Joe taught me how to do that. Unfortunately, I've only met one Joe Akerman in my whole life. I wish there was a way to make more of them and put them out in the colleges, because it would really help our knowledge of history and our citizenship. And Joe always knew how to, history was not just a sterile body of knowledge. He always linked it to citizenship. He always linked it to cultural literacy, to being an informed citizen, not being a professional historian, although that's wonderful to do, but not really where the need is. And the more I thought about it, with the need in America for good history and good teachers, that, wow, I was coming over and having the honor of speaking about somebody who was better at that than anyone I've ever encountered. And I've been through Florida State, 3 degrees there. I've taught at TCC, and I've taught here, and I've just never met anyone like that, and probably won't. But wish there was some way to create new Joe Hagermans, because they are really terrific and valuable. So, Joe's sense of humor, his gentle showing you the direction, I mean, his way with that helped to make me, whatever talents or success I've had teaching history, I owe a lot of it to Joe. He was my first mentor and my first, the first teacher that really showed me how to teach and not how to crank out heavily footnoted papers. All right, and for that I'll be forever grateful to Joe Akerman. And again, just pulling into my old spot and thinking I should go in there and have a cup of coffee with Joe Akerman really moved me on the way over here. And that's how much he meant to me. When you start a career and you've never had a full-time job, and you have somebody like Joe in the office next to you, it's something you'll never forget, and it's something that I will never forget either, okay? I didn't mean to get quite so choked up, but I just sort of remembered about Joe and all that. Well, there were so many good Joe Akerman stories, but I hope that I've given, and you guys, so many of you know him very well, and even longer than I did, but Joe and I were always the history department, and Joe and I had a special bond that I'm so glad that we had. And I think that will conclude my remarks. I hope I've given you a good sense of how important he was to me and how important he was to the history profession, specifically with his teaching. Thank you very much for having me over today.
Our final speaker is Miss Liu Sands, former Director of Library Services here. She was from 1961 to 1991. She was instrumental in establishing library services at what was then North Florida Junior College. She and Mr. Akerman worked together for years, and we are happy to have her with us today.
I come today as a friend. Joe Akerman was my friend. It was a friendship that grew incrementally through the years until at last it settled into the ease of long association, of shared experiences, of a mutual regard for literature and learning. My friend was a person of boundless curiosity, intellectual and otherwise. A man driven by ambition who took his young family with him as scholastic plums fell in Baltimore and Vancouver. Joe rarely raised his voice, certainly not in the library. His wicked sense of humor made it advisable to keep one's wit sharp at all times. He loved beautiful things. He liked Western art and Remington statuary and old dance music of the 50s. His interest in history did not preclude a fascination with the future. It was with great pride that he followed the career of his kinsman, Commander John Young, the 9th astronaut to walk on the surface of the moon. After many months away, Joe and Princess and Mark and Amy returned to Florida in NFCC. Joe resumed his daily walk from the library's entrance door to the west wall where the Florida collection was held. And one day there was a book, a real book, the now classic Florida Cattleman, with the author's name, Joseph A. Akerman, Jr. on its cover. Malcolm Johnson, then editor of the Tallahassee Democrat, praised the book in his editorial column, vowing that it was the best treatment of the subject today. The library staff was thrilled. We made punch and cookies and invited friends from the community in to congratulate our author. And that was just the beginning. One day, as I was straightening something on the shelf in the library, Joe walked over and asked, "Lou, do you know anything about the poet Wallace Stevens?" I said, "A candle is enough to light the world. It makes it clear. Even at noon, it glistens in essential dark. At night, it lights the fruit and the wine, the book and the bread, things as they are." His jaw dropped. He said, "Boy, I wish I could remember points like that." Actually, there was only one of the 33 standards blues guitar that I could play, but I kept that to myself. That was enough. We were off on another trip to inner space. It's not easy to fathom his meaning in Stephen's dark and enigmatic poem. It may be simpler, perhaps deceptively so, to attempt in the first few lines. A man bent over his guitar. A shearsman saw it. The day was green. They said, "You have a blue guitar. You do not play things as they are." And the man replied, "Things as they are changed upon the blue guitar. Take from it as you will." But we are speaking of friendship, and in this context, I shall jumble all of the words quoted above to be distilled. Our true friends bring light into our everyday world. In good humor, we find joy in sharing simple things. We delight in our friends' accomplishments and good fortune. Sometimes they help to keep us back to hunger and God. Good friends learn to grow gracefully together, and in so doing, they become forever irrevocably changed.
At this time, I would like to invite the Akerman family, along with the former and any, the current are here, any former library staff that are here, to unveil the plaque.